Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that may not be suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. When we last left off, I had told you all about Shelly and Jimmy Michael, all about their previous marriages and the tangled web of friends and exes that they still worked with. Shelly Michael, the perfect cheerleader, the vivacious nurse, the perfect wife and mother with her perfectly blended family. All of that had started to crumble underneath her greed. She was no longer able to hold the facade, and she had set her sights on a new man, once again, another man's wife. But Jimmy was finally getting wise to his wife's true nature. Jimmy Michael, loving father, hard worker, football coach, pillar of the community, and a God-fearing man. A man who had for so long wanted to save his marriage. But I think he'd finally had enough of her shit. He was taking control of his life, doing well in his business, and in his final days seemed more at peace. And Shelly Michael couldn't allow that. Welcome to episode 18, the finale to Cold, Cold Heart, the story of Shelly Michael. On Tuesday morning after Thanksgiving, Shelly Michael arrived for work at 6:30 a.m., early for her shift, and she made sure she was seen and remembered, even pinching Reggie hours on the butt. She checked in at the nurse's station, which she never did, and she made sure she was very conspicuous. Around 7:30, she called Jimmy's cell phone and left a message about packing lunch for the kids because Kylie wouldn't like what was on the menu at school that day. She also made a point to call the home phone. I think by now it's obvious she was setting up her alibi. But by 8 a.m., she was getting antsy. She told the clerk in pediatrics that she had left her pager in the car and would be right back. The clerk remembered thinking that was strange because Shelley didn't even use her pager. At 8:11 a.m., she was caught on surveillance cameras leaving the parking lot. She was seen back on another security camera at 8:27 a.m., walking back in with an umbrella, trying to cover her face. You can do the math. That leaves about 16 or 17 minutes that she was unaccounted for. Mind you, her house was only a mile away from the hospital. Meanwhile, the staff at Jimmy's office had become concerned. He was notorious for being the first one at work, and his office manager was immediately alarmed when she didn't see his car when she pulled in at 7:30. By 8 a.m., the staff was ready to do something about it. They weren't just worried about Jimmy. He had an appointment to set up a sleep apnea machine for a newborn before the baby was released from the hospital. It just wasn't like Jimmy to miss an appointment. The office manager started calling his cell. No answer. She called the house. No answer. She called over and over again, becoming increasingly worried. Jimmy was always available. He never missed a call. At this point, Bobby Teets, who remember was now working for Jimmy, was out on a delivery. The office manager called him and told him what was going on, and he started trying to call Jimmy himself. She asked him to stop by and check on Jimmy at his house, so Bobby drove over there. Around this time, 2 utility workers on Killarney Drive noticed smoke coming out of the rafters of Jimmy Michael's home, and they called 911. At 10:27 a.m., the windows of an upstairs bedroom blew out, and there wasn't just smoke, but flames leaping from the windows and rafters. By the time Bobby Teets arrived to check on Jimmy, police and the fire department were on scene. He saw Jimmy's car in the garage and turned stark white. He started screaming that Jimmy was in the house. He was so upset they put him in the back of a patrol car. At 10:35, he tried to call Shelley. He couldn't get her on the phone, so he called his wife Kelly and told her what was happening. Kelly called the hospital, and finally Shelly Michael came to the phone. Kelly just told her that her house was on fire and that she needed to get over there. Shelley calmly told the pediatric clerk that her house was on fire and she needed to go home, and left without another word. But instead, she went back to her office and called Jimmy's cell phone and left yet another message, this time saying she had heard their house was on fire. The clerk then saw her actually leave, not rushing or seemingly upset. Back at the scene, firefighters had finally made their way back to the bedroom. It had taken a lot of water to get the inferno down, and there was a lot of smoke. When they got to the room and realized there was a body, the imperative was to put the fire out and protect the body, which was already severely burned up. They called detectives to what was now a death scene. Detective Paul Mezzanot and Fire Lieutenant Ken Tennant walked into the bedroom. Even though the fireman told the detective the body was on the bed, he had trouble seeing it. Jimmy's body was burned beyond recognition, but he finally saw his teeth. Now that the fire was out and smoke had cleared, it was very obvious the fire was limited to not only the bedroom, but the bed. You could see the trail clearly. If you didn't know there had been a fire, walking downstairs you wouldn't even be able to tell. By now, Shelley had shown up and was acting properly hysterical. Rob Angus, her ex-husband, had heard about the fire and rushed to the scene. He was comforting her as detectives told her that her husband had been killed. They all later reported that there were no tears. Everyone handles shock differently, and maybe sometimes it isn't fair to judge someone's reaction. But these were seasoned firefighters and a homicide detective, and they already thought her behavior was strange. She was taken to a neighbor's house and laid on a couch, covered in a blanket. And she would stay there as friends and relatives heard the news and started coming in droves. Detective Mezzanot questioned Bobby Teets and Rob Angus, Shelley's current lover and former husband, who ironically both knew Jimmy Michael very well, and both men were very upset. They said Jimmy did not drink or do drugs and would never commit suicide. As the detective went on with his investigation, he would get this same answer from anyone who knew Jimmy. He was a hard-working man with very strong religious beliefs, and there was no reason to believe he would have done this to himself. But the detective kept pushing. One reason was the position of Jimmy's body on the bed. It was like he had been asleep. The body wasn't found in the normal position of people who had tried to escape a fire, or even those that had burned up, who would curl into a fetal position from the pain. What was left of him was a man that had been asleep on his back and never moved. This seemed impossible. But maybe Jimmy, who was a trained respiratory therapist and worked with medical supplies, had injected himself with something and then started the fire. But the arson investigators and detectives just did not believe this. It wasn't just the position of the body. It wasn't just what Jimmy's friends and family said about his character. Something about this fire, and especially about Shelly Michael's behavior, was hinky to every investigator involved. By 12:30, Jimmy's parents had gotten to the scene. The police and paramedics were able to restrain Ruth, but Denny would not be stopped. He had to see his son's body. He wound up in a fight with a policeman and didn't make it into the house. For now, they went to go see Shelley. They both noted that she was just lying there, not crying or upset. Nearly everyone noted Shelley's complete lack of emotion. It was unsettling. There wasn't a person who saw her who could relate to her apparent coldness. Detective Mezzanot was questioning everyone. He talked to Stephanie, who was extremely emotional and distraught. She described her relationship with her ex-husband as pretty good, but admitted there had been some problems, and she told him straight up about the CPS investigation after Jimmy had whipped Drew with his belt. But she insisted that Jimmy was an excellent father. When the detective went to talk to Shelley, she immediately snapped at him for talking to everyone but her. He said he found her to be very calm and controlling. If she hadn't already been sending red flags, she sure did now. Even Shelley's own mother described her as detached. Jimmy's mother, Ruth, had been purposely watching her daughter-in-law since she got there. She said, quote, "She just sat there. She didn't cry. She just sat there. I would describe it as cold." When Carrie Whitaker, Jimmy's oldest friend, came in to offer condolences, Shelley's first words were, "I love your outfit. Did you get that at B. Moss?" To another friend, who asked if they could get her something, Shelley sarcastically replied, "A new husband." I really could go on, and I want to stress again that I understand everyone grieves in different ways, and shock and numbness are very common. But that's not what this was. It wasn't just Jimmy's family or the detective judging her. It was everyone. Back at the scene, investigators were having trouble just removing Jimmy's body from the bed without further damaging it. It was like he had melted into the box spring. One leg was completely gone, and other limbs burned away as well. There was even a hole in his chest where the extreme temperature had caused a blowout, just like the window in his bedroom. This is a horrific thought. And they were still suspicious at his positioning. His muscles never contracted like they would have involuntarily if he had been alive during the fire. And that's because he wasn't. As they took him to the ambulance, Denny stopped them and insisted on seeing his son. They tried to tell him he would not recognize him, but Denny knew once Jimmy went to the morgue he would never see his son again. He needed to see him to say goodbye. Ruth would later say that this was the hardest part, that she never saw him and it didn't seem real. When they finally got his body to the morgue for autopsy, though most of his skin had burned away, with the exception of small patches on his backside, not all of his internal organs were gone. They knew almost right away he was dead before the fire. There was no soot in his throat, sinus cavities, or lungs. There was also no carbon monoxide found, which would have had to have been there if he had been breathing when the fire started. Tissue and blood samples from his heart and liver were sent off for toxicology testing. They also finally got his dental record so that they could positively identify him. It was indeed James Andrew Michael. Back at the house, Dan Estelle was there to support his wife Stephanie and help with all the kids. He witnessed Shelley and Bobby Teets lying together under a blanket. He also saw Shelley and Kelly Teets going over Jimmy's insurance together. For the record, I am not accusing the Teets of anything except foolish and insensitive behavior. And this won't be the only instance that Bobby and Shelley are caught seeming intimate. The arson investigators were having a tough time. The fire had burned so hot it would take a lot of testing, and the weather was not on their side. A canine dog, trained specifically to sniff for accelerants, alerted in 10 different locations. 4 were from the debris that had fallen through the bedroom floor to the living room. The fire had burned so hot that the headboard had become engulfed and burned through the flooring. It was the only sign downstairs that there had been a fire. The other 6 places the dog alerted to accelerant was in the bedroom, all around the bed where Jimmy was found. It was already so obvious that the fire was sustained mainly on the bed. Now they knew for sure that bed had been doused in accelerant. Also in the bedroom, under the bed, was the cap of a syringe. And they found a syringe in the kitchen sink. This part seems careless, but I have to imagine Shelly Michael assumed the whole house would burn and nothing would be found. By now, Detective Mezzanot had heard the rumors about Bobby and Shelley. She was already the first suspect, but now they had to take a hard look at Bobby as well. One person who was adamant about this was Jimmy's friend and Shelley's co-worker, Reggie Hours. He was the one who told the detective about the trip to Chicago. He also asked the detective if Jimmy had any signs of a struggle. Was he shot, stabbed, beaten, anything? The detective said no. It was Reggie Hours who first suggested that Shelley had poisoned her husband. After talking to the detective, Reggie went a step further and called a friend at the hospital and asked what kind of drugs they should look for. Dr. Mike Farabee, who was also a friend of Jimmy's, suggested several drugs and which would work the fastest, but he mentioned one in particular, a paralytic drug called vecuronium that is given to patients before they are intubated for a respirator. It paralyzes the body so the patient won't fight the tubing. But the patient is always also sedated. It's used in minor and major surgeries as well. The doctor also pointed out that it was a drug easily accessed at the hospital because it was not a narcotic, especially in the pediatric intensive care unit where Shelley worked. He said it was just sitting out where anyone could access it quickly. So he compiled a list of drugs, along with this one, for the tox screen technician to test for. Detective Mezzanot was interviewing all of Jimmy's friends, relatives, and associates, and his church friend Jeremy Miller was very helpful. Jeremy told him about Jimmy receiving the anonymous box with Shelley's sweater in it, accusing her of cheating. After talking to Jeremy, the detective had his first interview with a very nervous Bobby Teets. Bobby went over the relationship between the two couples, saying they were all just good friends. He confirmed that he was going into the embroidery business with Shelley. He never admitted to the affair, but he kept saying over and over again that he hoped the fire was an accident and that Jimmy had died peacefully. He said, quote, "It bothers me every day just thinking about it. I would be happier to know he didn't suffer. I would be able to sleep a lot better." I don't think Bobby knew he could be a suspect or that Shelley was a suspect at this point. He had an alibi, so the police were not looking at him hard for the arson, but they did want to crack his affair with Shelley. The detective wanted proof of the Chicago trip he'd been tipped off to before proceeding. After Bobby's interview, he called the hotel and confirmed that there had only been one room booked, and he arranged to have the surveillance cameras checked immediately. Now the detective sat back down with Rob Angus, who was also telling him to check for drugs. As it turns out, there was yet another connection at Ruby Memorial. Rob's sister, Shannon Rudy, had once been Shelley's nursing supervisor. She told Rob to tell the investigators to look for the drug vacuronium as well. Shelley may have been the one working at Ruby, but all of her co-workers, exes, and everyone there knew who she really was. And the fact that two different men came to the detective with insider information and picked out the same drug was really telling. Obviously, this drug was as easy to take out of the hospital as Reggie had first suggested. Reggie by now had his own conversation with Shelley. He played along, acting sympathetic, gently questioning her on what she thought really happened. She told him that she was afraid she left an iron on in the bedroom and that she felt really guilty about it. Reggie assured her that the iron couldn't have caused the type of fire, but she was insistent that this was probably what happened. Reggie immediately called Detective Mezzanot back and told him what she said. All of Jimmy's friends were coming to the detective on their own accord, and also Rob Angus, who strikes me as such a good guy. Technically, Shelly Michael had helped break up his marriage, but he held no animosity and had always gotten along with Jimmy. Now, he set up a memorial fund for Shelley to help with expenses. He was on hand to help with the children, and yet he still cared so much for Jimmy that he was also giving tips to the police. Shelley was staying with Jimmy's parents in his hometown in Cumberland, Maryland. That is where the funeral was to be held. And when a friend called to offer to collect Shelley's mail and bring it to her, she casually said to just look for an envelope from Morgantown Bank and Trust. It would have been the bank card from the memorial fund. That was the only mail Shelley wanted to see. The Saturday that Jimmy's obituary appeared in the newspaper was the same day of visitation at the funeral home. The family arrived first, and Shelley insisted on seeing Jimmy's body. The funeral director refused. He said she should not see him in that condition. Jimmy's father stepped in and told Shelley he had seen him and she didn't need to. But Shelley was outraged and caused a scene. She didn't care the state of the body. She wanted to see it. To me, this is more of Shelley's act for dramatic effect, which is silly considering she never bothered to muster up any tears or otherwise seem to grieve. But she was all about her angry scenes. Carrie Whitaker, Jimmy's best friend since grade school, was at the visitation. Again, she was a psychologist, and she not only watched Shelley herself, but many of their old schoolmates, who hadn't seen Jimmy in years, kept approaching her because they knew she had stayed in touch with her old friend. Every one of them asked what in the hell was wrong with Shelly Michael. Carrie would later give her own opinion to the detective. She said she just seemed cold, flat. She had no affect whatsoever. There were no tears, nothing. Again, over and over, there is that word, cold. Drew, now 12 years old, was inconsolable at his father's visitation. He even sat on top of the closed casket talking to his father. Stephanie went to try and talk to her son, and Shelley again pitched a fit. She told everyone she wanted to be alone with her husband and to get out. Later, she complained quite a bit about poor Drew. Even after Jimmy's death, this bitch was still bullying and belittling his son. After visitation, Shelley asked Jimmy's parents if Bobby and Kelly Teets could also spend the night at their house. She was spending the night there and wanted them there for comfort. The Michaels agreed. They had their suspicions about Shelley, but they did not know yet all the detective knew or about the affair. So for now, they were keeping the peace. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Denny Michael got up because he couldn't sleep and left the house for a bit. When he came back, he went in through the basement, where he caught Shelley and Bobby hugging, and Bobby was kissing her on the cheek. He said when Shelley saw him, she pushed Bobby away. She wasn't even going to lie and try to say he was comforting her. She just pretended that Denny hadn't seen them together. The next day at the funeral, Drew sobbed hysterically, and Stephanie was also crying. She kept looking at Shelley and couldn't believe there was no emotion. Here she was, the ex-wife, and could not stop crying. Of course she had always loved Jimmy, and he was the father of her children, but still, the ex-wife is beside herself with grief, and Shelley couldn't even wring out some fake tears. It was so obvious. Everyone at the graveside was crying, but not Shelley. You can only imagine the grief of Jimmy's family and friends. He was a 33-year-old man, taken in the prime of his life in the most gruesome way. No one knew yet that he had been poisoned, but assumed he suffered in the fire. This was an incredibly tragic and heartbreaking funeral, and everyone there remarked on how cold and indifferent Shelly Michael seemed. The following Monday, Ruby Memorial granted Shelley a 6-month leave of absence. Her next immediate action was to see the insurance agent. She was there first thing Monday morning after the funeral to get instructions on how to fill out the paperwork to claim the $500,000 life insurance policy. And even before the funeral, she had been to Jimmy's office. Because he owned 55%, the partners needed to buy her out. She was already seeing to this before Jimmy was even in the ground. That afternoon, Shelley reluctantly agreed to a memorial service in Morgantown. She had tried to fight it, but Jimmy's family insisted that his local friends and coworkers should have the right to say goodbye as well. She agreed, but insisted that it be held the following day, despite the fact that it would be hard to publicize the arrangements so that everyone could get there. But she was adamant that they get it over with. Shelley met with the pastor, Reverend Goodwin, the morning of the service, and she brought Bobby Teets with her. The pair sat there holding hands in his office while he went over the plans for the service. The Reverend had assumed that Bobby was a family member, but kept growing more uncomfortable with the couple's closeness. He later said, quote, "I honestly felt they behaved more like lovers than friends." He was also struck by how emotionless she was. She had no interest in giving input on the planning and told the Reverend just to take care of it. He found this extremely unusual, as families usually are very involved in the planning. Jimmy's parents arrived in Morgantown early for the memorial service. They were there to meet with the detective. Denny Michael immediately accused Shelley of murdering his son. He even said she was a nurse practitioner and had probably drugged him. He could not have known the tips Detective Mezzanot had already gotten about Shelley. This was just his intuition. The detective also came to the service, something that is not unusual in an active investigation. He would go to observe behavior. And he found that Shelley was not only detached, but actively irritated to be there. The day after the memorial service, Detective Mezzanot had interviews set up with Shelley and Bobby Teets. He purposely scheduled them back-to-back, with Bobby going first, so Shelley would have to sit there waiting and wondering what was being said. By now, the police had the incriminating videos from the hotel in Chicago, as well as the surveillance footage of Shelley from the hospital. And they didn't even need it with Bobby. He broke down and immediately confessed to the affair. He said he was not in love with Shelley and wanted to stay with his wife. He said he and Shelley had sex numerous times and also confirmed about their trip to Chicago. I honestly think Bobby was glad to get this off his chest, and I think he was even more relieved that now that it was in the open, the affair with Shelley had to end. He did still hold on to the ridiculous hope that Kelley wouldn't have to learn of the affair, but the detective told him no, he would be required to testify at trial, and he had better go ahead and fess up to his wife. Now it was Shelley's turn. They immediately told her about Bobby's confession. She denied the affair and proceeded to detail their weekend in Chicago again, explaining that while it was one room, that was only to save money. It was a suite, and Bobby had slept on the couch. The detective outright accused her of lying, and she would not admit anything. He switched topics to the fire. He told her that Jimmy's death and the fire were suspicious, and she appeared unmoved. He then stated that the fire was arson, and she replied, "You're kidding." He also told her about the blood and tissue samples he had sent off for testing, and that they were looking specifically for drugs. Then he told her, quote, "We pretty much have an idea from the autopsy how he died." Shelley said, "Okay, can you tell me?" Detective Mezzanot had been playing softball with Shelley for most of the investigation, acting like her friend. She even called him by his first name, Paul. He now begged her to come clean, to unburden herself, and to help herself now by telling him the truth. She finally capitulated that she understood how her relationship to Bobby could be misconstrued, but still insisted that they were just friends. The detective moved on to the day of the fire, asking Shelley to walk him again through everything. She told the exact same story as before: her arrival at the hospital, making her rounds, her trip to the car for her pager. Her story would not change. The detective circled back around to the fire and gently said, "I have a feeling you know Jimmy didn't suffer." Shelley said she didn't know what he was talking about. This went on for 2 hours, and Shelly Michael did not budge an inch. After the interview, she called Bobby and asked him what he had said. He lied to her and said he hadn't told the police anything, but after this conversation, he didn't really talk to her again. After his own interview with the police, he had gone home and confessed everything to Kelley. He was now fully willing to cooperate and wanted desperately to save his marriage. Surprisingly, at least to me, Kelley was shocked by his confession. Maybe she was just too close to see it. She was Shelley's best friend. And she and Bobby had been married for 10 years. He had never cheated before, and she thought the couples were just close friends. So I guess she had blinders on. And even though she was deeply hurt, she chose to stand by her husband. Now Bobby Teets requested a polygraph exam. He knew he was a suspect and was desperate to clear his name. And he passed. Next, it was Shelley's turn. Sergeant Merrill, a polygraph examiner with more than 20 years' experience, had watched Shelley's interview with the detective through two-way glass. He watched her try to manipulate and control the interview. So when he got her in his room, he used the same tactic, pretending to be her friend, even calling her honey, saying he understood she was upset. This was the preliminary interview, before she was hooked up to the machine. Merrill wanted to get Shelley shaken up before he started the exam. He first caught her off guard by telling her about the surveillance film from the hospital that showed her leaving. She appeared shocked, but then quickly regrouped. She now remembered that she had decided to move her Ford Expedition to the parking garage because it had been heavily raining. When Merrill pointed out that they had footage of her parking the car some 17 minutes later and walking back inside, not from the garage, she said that yes, she drove around the garage for a while, unable to find a spot before returning to the parking lot. He then asked her if she went by her house, and she said no, she was certain she had not. He asked if it was possible that anyone had seen her at her house that day, and she said no, she did not leave the hospital. Then he tried to catch her off guard again by asking why Bobby Teets had said they had an affair. She adamantly denied the affair, saying she had no idea why he would say such a thing. And then he carefully explained exactly how the polygraph worked. There were 2 tubes that were to go around her thoracic and abdominal area to monitor her breathing, and a cardio cuff on her arm to watch her blood pressure. He then showed her a set of numbers on a piece of paper and told her to circle one and then put it in her pocket. He explained to her that he wanted her to lie about the number. As he read them off, she was to say no to each one. After she was done, he told her she had picked number 5. Now Shelly Michael was scared. She didn't want anything else to do with the polygraph. He had picked her number. She abruptly asked to stop the test, and as he was unhooking her from the equipment, she suddenly admitted to the affair. She said, quote, "Listen, I'm not taking your polygraph, but I'll be honest with you, I did have the affair." We all know polygraphs are not admissible in court, but they are useful in interrogations, if for no other reason than to get the subject on the defensive. It's pretty clear Shelly Michael thought she'd walk in that room and pass with flying colors. She probably considered herself an excellent liar. She'd had plenty of practice. When Sergeant Merrill picked up on her very first lie that had nothing to do with Jimmy, she was shaken and bolted. She then left the room and went back to the interrogation room with Detective Mezzanot. Sergeant Merrill joined them. At this point, they took the gloves off. The tone in the interrogation room became much more accusatory. The detective flat out told her they had an eyewitness that saw her in her driveway at 8:20 that morning. Shelley never even flinched. She kept denying that she'd left hospital grounds. But the thing is, she knew they weren't lying or misleading her. Cops are allowed a bit of leeway with the truth in interrogation rooms. They often claim to have imaginary witnesses. But Shelley had seen her neighbor that morning. He was a respiratory therapist at Ruby Memorial also. So not just her neighbor, but he also knew her from work. Sean Alt had been coming off the night shift. He was also a voluntary firefighter. It was pouring rain when he got home, just down the street from Shelley's house. But when he got out of his car, he smelled smoke. He knew the difference between the smell of a chimney and that of a fire, and he walked around his house concerned. He was certain it wasn't his own house, so he stood in his driveway and looked around the neighborhood, but he couldn't see anything. At this point, the bed Jimmy was on was only smoldering, but there was smoke in the air. He just couldn't see it. He went inside and showered, and then came back out to drive to the firehouse. He still smelled smoke, but couldn't find it. At 8:20 a.m., he passed Shelly Michael at the stop sign at the top of the hill on their road. He obviously recognized his neighbor and co-worker, so he waved and she looked away. He wasn't surprised. She was known for her moods at work. He drove on to the fire station, confirmed that nothing had been called in about a fire on his street, and then fell asleep in his bunk. Around lunch, he was woken by a fellow firefighter who told him about a big fire on Killarney Drive, a couple of doors down from his house. He called mutual friend Reggie Hours, who told him that Jimmy hadn't made it. Sean told him that was weird because he had smelled smoke earlier that morning and had seen Shelly Michael, but nothing was on fire at the time. Reggie didn't say anything else, but a few minutes later, Detective Mezzanot called Sean's cell phone. Reggie had tipped him off again. Now back to the interrogation. Shelley would have known who this witness was, but she stared back at the cops, her face giving away nothing. Merrill said all he got was, quote, a cold stare. Mezzanot tried explaining how he would word it to the prosecutor, that there was a fire and that Shelley had 17 minutes of time that were not accounted for, and that they knew she was lying because they had a witness. But Shelley stuck to her story. Merrill asked her how long her drive to work was, and she said 10 minutes. He said, really? And this time she conceded that, well, no, it was probably more like 5. Detective Mezzanot spoke up then and told Shelley he had tested the timing himself. He had made it from the hospital to Shelley's driveway in 4 minutes. He said he waited in the driveway for 3 or 4 minutes, plenty of time to run in the house, douse the bed, and strike a match, and then he left and drove back to the hospital and actually beat the 17-minute window of time. They spent the next few minutes playing good cop, bad cop with her, with Mezzanot playing the good cop. Remember, she was still calling him Paul, like they were on good terms. Merrill told her she should trust the detective because he was the only one that was still on her side, and there was no way they could explain those 17 minutes to a jury without her cooperation. Finally, after almost 2.5 hours of interrogation, Shelley admitted that she had left the hospital grounds that day, but she claimed it was because she had to go pick up something for her son and take it to his school. She must have realized pretty quickly that this was a bad lie, because when they asked her what she went in the house for, she quickly said she never went in the house, that she realized she didn't need it. They kept asking what. What was it she needed? She finally said it was the paperwork she needed to fax for the embroidery financing. So then they said, okay, fine. Then why didn't you go in and get it? She replied that she suddenly realized she already had it with her, so she turned around and went back to work. But the important thing was, they had just gotten Shelly Michael to admit that she had been at her house that morning, right around the time that her coworker and neighbor saw her and had smelled smoke. They had her now. When they kept pushing on why she lied, she lamely said she didn't want her boss to find out that she had left the hospital, that she was scared she would get in trouble. Merrill asked her if she wasn't more scared of being arrested, and informed her that they knew the fire was no accident. They knew her husband was dead before it started. They knew she was lying. She was the number one suspect. And then he left the room. Shelley left the station after 6 hours of interrogation. She was still trying to play innocent with Mezzanot, who continued to play good cop with her. She insisted that she only left out the affair with Bobby out of embarrassment, and that she had left out about going to the house that morning because she felt guilty that she hadn't gone inside. If she had only gone inside, she could have saved her husband. Later, both Mezzanot and Merrill agreed that she was one of the most arrogant, cold, and calculating people they had ever interviewed in over 20 years of investigations. And now even Shelley must have known she was in deep shit, even if she wouldn't budge further on her story. She went home to her parents that evening and flippantly told her mother that the police were just trying to scare her. Kathy Goots, who was actually scared, said, "We need to get you an attorney," and got on the phone. The next morning, Detective Mezzanot got a call from a prominent defense attorney from Clarksburg named Tom Dyer. He informed him that now he was representing Shelly Michael, and she would no longer be answering any questions. Fair enough. It's a testament to Shelley's ego that she got this far, though, that she really thought she could talk her way out of this. Bobby Teets went in for a post-polygraph interview. Though he had passed, there were some flags. The investigators believed him when he said he felt guilty because of the affair, and he feared that Shelley had killed Jimmy so they could be together. He wound up taking another polygraph around Christmas, and this, coupled with confirmation on his movements that morning, helped police to clear him as a suspect. Shelley was going on about her life as if she wasn't a suspect, often going by the house to pick up things. On December 13th, she met with the insurance people again, who now informed her the payout was not imminent because the fire was suspicious. She agreed to be questioned on tape, and now mentioned the iron theory. She told them that she had ironed her shirt that morning, and sometime before she had noticed that her iron's automatic switch-off feature was not working. She theorized that it was possible she left it on and it had fallen over. She had floated this theory before to Reggie Hours, who also thought it was ridiculous. But this was her story for now, or at least what she said was the only cause she could think of. Carrie Whitaker, Jimmy's closest friend since childhood, called Detective Mezzanot for a phone interview. She said that she and Jimmy spoke on the phone once a week and never missed a call. She provided much detail to the detective about their marital issues, even about Shelley trying to force him to have another child. She also gave him her clinical analysis of Shelley's behavior at the funeral. Remember, Carrie was a psychologist. Her opinion wasn't just based on emotion. And she said she felt Shelley behaved cold and detached. One thing I have found really interesting in this case is how much Tom Dyer, her attorney, has been willing to talk ever since. He's given interviews to many TV shows, and to author John Glatt, whose book Playing with Fire was one of my main resources for this episode. You definitely should check out that book if you would like more information. Tom Dyer said the first time he met with Shelley at his office, he left the room for a moment and had left his Coca-Cola on the table. When he came back, he said he'd be damned before he'd pick up that Coke again after it sat there unattended with Shelly Michael. He told John Glatt, quote, "The first thing that catches your attention are her Charles Manson eyes. She's the only woman I've ever met in my life with absolutely black hole eyes. Look right into her eyes and tell me it doesn't send a shiver up your spine. However, he insists that he developed a fond relationship with his client. I find that kind of hilarious considering all he says about her in interviews. Up to this point in the investigation, there had been little to no publicity. On December 23rd, the Dominion Post, a local paper, ran a story about officials being back on the scene, which prompted a furious Shelley to claim that they had no right to be in her house, although obviously they had a search warrant and she knew it. She was grandstanding. That Christmas, Jimmy's poor parents had to keep up a front and still see her. Drew outright refused to be around her, so Ruth and Steve, Jimmy's brother, went to dinner with Shelley. Shelley was mad that Denny and Drew weren't there, but other than that, Steve said she was downright bubbly. You'd never know she'd lost her husband less than a month before. On January 9th, Shelley turned in a 34-page handwritten summary of belongings lost in the fire to the insurance company. She claimed $72 for a basket of nail polish, and also $40 for her framed wedding vows. She even listed the number of socks Jimmy kept in his drawer. The second week of February 2006, Jimmy's tox screen came back. He tested positive for the drug rocuronium, related to the drug vercuronium that they had been instructed to look for. The blood from Jimmy's heart contained high levels of the paralytic drug. They sent off liver tissue for further testing just to be sure. On March 4th, the second toxicology report came back, and Jimmy's death certificate was changed by the chief medical examiner. The cause of death was now listed as homicide, by, quote, an intentionally injected lethal dose of rocuronium by another person. When I looked up the drug rocuronium, I discovered that there had been many tests comparing it to the vercronium, and it was found to be more effective in pediatric intubations, as it worked quicker. The drug only took about 60 seconds to take effect in a small child. So it does seem plausible that this is what they would have on a pediatric unit, where Shelly Michael worked. A couple of days after the death certificate was changed, Denny Michael got a copy of it in his mailbox. They had sent it to him by mistake. It technically should have gone to Shelley as Jimmy's wife. She would be next of kin. The police were relieved that Denny had gotten it instead, because for whatever reason, they were still waiting to arrest Shelley. Now, Denny Michael said they'd better go arrest her, or he was coming down there to find out why. Finally, the criminal complaint was written up for Michelle Michael. That same afternoon, a magistrate signed an arrest warrant, and Shelley was finally picked up. She went before the Morgantown Magistrate Court and was granted a $100,000 bond for the arson charge, but Shelley would be transferred to jail before she could be considered for bond on the murder charge. That was up to the circuit court judge. The next morning's headline on the Dominion Post was, Wife charged with murder, Shelly Michael also accused of arson in fatal Suncrest fire. Now it was out, and the small town was descended upon by all kinds of media. The following morning, Shelley was granted a $350,000 bond by the circuit court judge. 6 days after her arrest, her parents posted the full $450,000 bond, and Shelly Michael walked out of jail. But she was to stay confined to her home to be electronically monitored. She was fitted with an electronic ankle bracelet and sent home. And before long, all of Morgantown started calling in Shelley sightings. She found every way possible to get around her restrictions. She was allowed to go to the grocery store, her doctor, and work, but that was it. But she was often seen around the mall. She even talked the officer who checked her monitor into letting her wear it around her thigh so it wouldn't show when she wore a dress. Of course, no one was hiring Nurse Michael these days, so she took a job in a shop in her hometown of Clarksburg. But she was consistently caught where she shouldn't be and was hauled in before the judge. Initially, the judge said that though she had violated regulations, it wasn't serious enough to revoke her bond. Well, that only emboldened Shelley, who was seen out even more frequently afterwards. Now, the CBS show 48 Hours had set up camp in town, getting interviews with anyone they could. Soon the affair with Bobby Teets hit the newspaper. If public sentiment had been against Shelley before, now she was outright hated. The Shelley sightings, as they were called, became so numerous as to call into question their validity. But it's hard to blame Morgantown. It's a small town, and she had killed a beloved father, businessman, coach, and pillar of the church. They wanted her head. During these months, Tom Dyer, her attorney, said that she tried to control every aspect of her defense, writing up her own briefs, writing up character analyses of Jimmy's friends and family. Honestly, the gall of this woman is amazing. She even wrote a closing statement she wanted Tom to use. The only thing the murderess and her attorney agreed on was that she would have to testify. Tom Dyer said, quote, "It's a right she has, but 12 people on the jury don't give a shit. Their immediate reaction is, son of a bitch, this person's got something to hide." So Shelley spent weeks rehearsing at Q&A sessions with Tom and his associates. In January of 2007, they won an important motion, getting the trial moved to Charleston, West Virginia, due to pretrial publicity. Meanwhile, the Morgantown investigators had called in the state police, the ATF, and even the FBI to figure out how the fire was started. The ATF wound up compiling 7 different models for the trial, all of which showed the same thing. The problem was, no one could understand how a fire could smolder for hours after Shelley was seen at 8:20 a.m. before the utility worker saw the smoke around 10:30 a.m. and called it in. What the ATF models found that, because a fire needs oxygen, Shelley had made a mistake. She had carefully closed the bedroom door, and with the door and the windows closed, there had not been enough oxygen to feed the flames. But when the headboard finally fell through the bottom floor, that let in enough air in the room for it to become engulfed, and finally the window blew out. Police and firefighters had been on the scene and quickly put it out, but the ATF were able to prove that yes, the bed Jimmy was on could have smoldered for over 2 hours until it got enough oxygen to become a full-fledged fire. I'm going to warn you now, at this point I wish I had time to go all the way through her trial, because it is really fascinating. But this case could probably go 4 episodes if I tried to do that. Instead, I will attempt to summarize, because you already know from the first episode that Shelley was convicted. I will tell you, though, that those Shelley sightings finally paid off. The following June, she was spotted getting her nails done. That's right, she finally had her bail revoked for getting her damn nails done. This woman will do what she wants when she wants to, rules be damned, even if that meant she could go to jail. But I don't think Shelly Michael ever thought she would actually go to jail. The state put on a pretty strong case. The evidence was circumstantial. The Shelley sighting at 8:20 that morning, the surveillance cameras from the hospital, the readiness of the drug used to kill Jimmy Michael at Shelley's disposal, her affair with Bobby Teets. All of this made her look bad, but didn't necessarily prove she killed her husband. There was no physical evidence tying her to the scene of the crime, despite the syringe that was found. There had been no fingerprints on it. I'm sure Shelly Michael, trained nurse, wore rubber gloves when she injected her husband. And the author John Glatt pointed out in his book that nurses are trained not to recap syringes. It would have been natural for her to throw it on the floor. That is why they found the cap to the syringe under the bed. She probably dropped it thoughtlessly, or she expected the entire house to burn and never really thought it would be found. Shelley herself was the turning point for the trial. Up to that point, the prosecution was not sure if they had her. If you Google this story, look for the journal from a juror at this trial that was published afterwards. You might find it surprising after all I've told you, but they were not fully convinced that Shelley had killed her husband. The juror writes about how slowly throughout the trial they watched her story unravel, and they could not believe her lack of emotion when the crime scene photos and the autopsy photos were shown. Jimmy's family could be heard sobbing in court, but Shelly Michael just sat there with a blank face, busily scribbling notes and handing them to her attorney. But she did finally take the stand, and the juror said at that point they really hoped she would get up there and convince them that this mountain of evidence was wrong, that somehow she just couldn't have done it. They did really need to hear from her, just as Tom Dyer predicted. However, no amount of pretrial preparation could stop the real Shelly Michael once she was on the stand. She doubled down on her most ridiculous scenarios of the crime itself, even suggesting that her husband had committed suicide. When she stepped down from the stand, they were horrified, but no longer conflicted. Shelly Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and arson. The jury did stay out for a few days, though, and the online journal states that initially they were split, but after going back over the mountains of testimony, there was just no doubt that Shelley did it. West Virginia does not have the death penalty. Incidentally, it's the only southern state that doesn't. Shelley could get life in prison, or what they call life with mercy. That means she would be eligible for parole in 15 years on the murder charge. And this is exactly what the jury recommended. In the article, the anonymous juror said that they felt she had killed without mercy, and that locking her up for the rest of her life was actually too light of a punishment. Suggesting that she get life with mercy meant that Shelly Michael would sit in jail, wondering and yearning as the years went by that one day she would get out, instead of accepting her situation and making a life for herself in jail. At her sentencing, she was allowed to make a statement and droned on for a long time, full of self-pity, and telling the jury that a life sentence for her was also one for her children. However, Jimmy's family was also able to make statements, and they were powerful. Perhaps the most devastating was the letter from Jimmy's daughter, Jacy. It read in part, quote, "Shelley Goots has a cold-blooded heart and an evil mind. I hope you give her the maximum by law." And the judge agreed with this recommendation, and also sentenced her to 20 years for the arson to be served consecutively, meaning she might get parole after 15 for the murder, but she would still have to serve the 20 for arson. After he gave her sentence, in which he honed in on the coldness of her character, Shelly Michael, always having to have the last word, stood up and said she meant no disrespect, but, quote, "I am not cold, I am not calculated, and I did not kill my husband." The judge replied, "Your guilt and innocence is not the issue. It has already been decided. The jury decided it, and quite frankly, I agree with the jury." Of course, Shelly Michael would do everything in her power in the appeals process, and she has her supporters. There was even a Justice for Shelley website up for a while, though it is no longer accessible. She now has a Justice for Shelley Facebook page that is still active, though there are not many posts. It appears to be run by her daughter, Coley, who wrote some emotional posts about her mother. It doesn't surprise me in the least that Shelly Michael would put her daughter through this. Nothing she does is anything but self-serving. That woman would do anything to get her way, and the only thing that ever really meant anything to her was money. I found it really gratifying when I found court records that Jimmy's ex-wife Stephanie took Shelley to civil court on behalf of her children many times over the years, squeezing any dollar she could from Shelley, and at the very least, tying her up in expensive civil litigation, which of course Shelley fought tooth and nail. Money really is the only damn thing that ever mattered to this woman. The medical examiner testified that it would have taken 13 agonizing minutes for Jimmy Michael to die. And after he finally did, Shelly Michael got up, showered, put on all her makeup, fixed her hair, and then set an iron on that bed. The prosecutor pointed out something that is always one of my favorite tropes. Within every good lie is a little bit of truth. Shelley continuously brought up that iron as the real reason for the fire. They believe she really did try the iron first, and then waited 2 hours at work to get the call that her house was on fire. When the call didn't come, she drove the mile to her house, doused her husband in their marital bed with an accelerant, dropped a match, and walked out, closing the door behind her. She is indeed a cold woman, and I think a complete narcissist. She embodied the sort of self-centered, manipulative person who always has to have the attention on herself. The sort of unfeeling, heartless woman who could slip into bed next to her husband, inject him with a paralytic drug, and then watch him die. Jimmy Michael was a respiratory therapist. He would have known exactly what was happening to him, and exactly who did it. Southern Fried True Crime is written and produced by me, Erica Kelley. The original graphic art is by Coley, and Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio. As always, if you enjoyed the show, tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on Stitcher and many other apps. If you're interested in supporting the show, come check out my Patreon page or my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, where you can make a one-time donation by hitting the donate button. I also have a merchandise store open at whatamaneuver.net. If you have any comments, corrections, or suggestions, you can email me at southernfriedtruecrime@gmail.com. I love hearing from you guys, and I'm always looking for new cases, so please feel free to reach out. I'm also all over social media. Just search the show name in your favorite platform if you'd like to connect with me there. If you're interested in discussing the Shelly Michael case or any other episodes further, come check out my discussion group. It is linked to my main Facebook page. I would love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.